think that it really gets at almost even why I wanted to write this book. And what's missing, I think, in the conversation, a lot of people really, it's inseparable for them. The idea of being a Christian is inseparable from everybody should be a Christian. And unless everybody should be a Christian, why be a Christian at all? And for me, reclaiming Christianity had to be a really new paradigm where me being a Christian is saying something about me. It's not the should. I'm not telling people what they should do. I'm talking about my spirituality. And the reason that that's so hard, and this is inseparable from the hell conversation, because that should is, why? Really, if you keep peeling back the onion layers, it's because God will punish you if you're not. That really is what's behind the curtain of that should for people. And once you deconstruct hell, then you have to have a new reason for your spirituality. And this is why so many people, even though hell is it's not really bedrock. It's not bedrock New Testament doctrine. Paul doesn't mention it a single time. We talk like Paul's the big systematician in the New Testament. He's the one putting the puzzle pieces for Christianity together. Somehow he does it without mentioning hell a single time. And yet, when I say there's no hell, the first question I get is, why even be a Christian? What did Jesus even save you from? The system falls apart completely. It is a system built on avoiding punishment. And when you have that system, one of the main reasons it's so hard to deconstruct is it provides the institution of Christianity with the biggest possible why you should be a Christian. It's why they count conversions and baptisms. It's the whole thing is about, it's a numbers game. And it's ultimately the most important numbers game there is, saving people from hell. And you take that away and their whole reason for existence starts to fall apart. And the big light bulb moment I had was, oh my God, that was the foundation of our spirituality. In other words, it was not about cultivating a way of love for the sake of this life and for the sake of the world, especially the most vulnerable of the world. It was ultimately a punishment avoidance game. And so I realized we have to, as Christians, if we're going to stay in it, we've got to find a whole new positive spirituality. Otherwise, throw out the whole thing. It's just punishment avoidance.
Welcome to the Shadow Mike podcast and YouTube channel, which aims to provide you with language, tools, and guidance in your journey towards personal and relational wholeness. We'll discuss topics ranging from psychology, spirituality, leadership, sexuality, and more. My name is Michael, and I will be your guide for stimulating musings and host for insightful interviews with thought leaders, practitioners, and experts who have a thing or two to share about living an integrated and meaning-making life. Whether you're looking to deepen your connection with your interior world, overcome challenges in your relationships, or expand your psychosomatic horizons with fresh perspectives and paradigms, the Shadow Mike podcast and YouTube channel offers a safe, playful, yet challenging space for dialogue and introspection. It is all a gift, so let's go enjoy it together. Yeah, and I think that something you really hit on in the book is, the middle portion about really deconstructing hell and the whole system and the belief behind it. That is so essential because I see a lot of times, and I'll dog on progressive Christians a lot because there is this sense that if you just kind of like sell a more loving version, that it will somehow override that system. But it's like, no. Like, if your unconscious mind believes that hell is kind of the big end game, then your love will always be oriented towards overcoming that. So like when people are like, well, like it's all about love, it's all about, Jesus was all about love, and yet they live with that existential dread. Why is it essential? Like, how do people deconstruct personally? We'll start with the personal because I want to get into the macro and like the social ramifications as well. But how do people deconstruct personally the belief system that's lodged in their bodies around hell?
The how is a tough one because I do think that this lives in your body a bit, and it isn't just changing your mind, because a lot of us were told. I know for me, if you were raised in the church, and I was raised in a more fundamentalist type of church, but for most people, when they first hear about God, I did a seminar recently, and I asked everybody, if you got saved or born again at some point in your life, if that was an experience you had, stand up. And everybody in that seminar stood up. And then I was like, okay, if hell was a part of the conversation in that decision, like you learned about the fact that if you didn't get saved, you might go to hell. If that was given to you, if that was in your mental model at the time of that decision, remain standing. Everybody remain standing. And then I said, okay, if that happened to you before 10 years old, remain standing. And a couple people sat down, but the vast majority of the people remained standing. And so literally from the time, for me, it was 5 years old, from the time I knew the idea of God, from when I was introduced to the concept of what is a God? What the fuck are we talking about? We're talking about God. I was told from jump, it was a guy that wanted to punish me for who I was already as a 5-year-old. I was already in danger as a 5-year-old. And then I was told, okay, but don't worry, there's like an age of accountability. But honestly, it's not in the Bible. We kind of made it up. We're not totally sure if it applies to you. I remember thinking that, boy, I sure hope that age of accountability is like 8 or 9, because like, what if something happens to me? I could go to hell. Like, what if my salvation isn't totally put together? Because we were literally taught that this was our birthright, that punishment. And so that was baked into our ideas about God and ourselves, and of course, other people. I mean, I was told that my family members who were not Christians, my uncles and my aunts, my grandparents, my next door neighbors, my best friend who was Catholic, all of those people in my life, my most precious relationships, actually, many of them were going to hell. And so we prayed for them as a kid. And so all of that was, as a fundamentalist, heightened over an evangelical because we were hearing about it more. The major difference between an evangelical and a fundamentalist is emphasis and vibes. They believe the same things, but it was such a relief when I left fundamentalism. Like, oh, finally, we're not talking about hell all the time. This is great. Until I realized, oh, you all believe the exact same thing. You're just like kind of trying to ignore it most of the time and focus on the good parts. But it was the same story. And I think a lot of people, they just kind of tuck that existential dread behind the curtain, and it comes out in moments. Oh, I hope that person who died was a believer. Well, why? Why do you hope that? Because I hope they're in heaven. Well, where else would they be? They're being punished by God right now. Like, we believe that about the people that we love. And that's not fundamentalists. That's regular evangelicals. And so we have to carry that. And that's baked into not just our idea of what it means to be a Christian, but really our idea of who God is and what it means to be in a relationship with God. Did you ever have an option to not be in a relationship with God? I was told that you had to be in a relationship with God or you'd be punished in hell. And so there is something fundamental there. And so to answer your original question, just to bring it back to that, like, I don't think you can just be like, well, I hope there's no hell, because a lot of people throw away the idea of God and they become an atheist. And I think a lot of that has to do with they're throwing away the punishing God that might damn them to hell. I also throw that God in the trash bin. That's not a God that I believe in at all. I have more in common with many atheists than with somebody who believes in a punitive God, I would say. And so to
100%.
deconstruct some of that is hard. It takes, I think, some real deep rooted work of like your view of yourself, your view of God, your view of other people, and realizing that that punitiveness was kind of woven into everything.
Yeah. Well, it's when you're that young, you're 5. I was 8. I remember praying this prayer, and I had this very spiritual moment where I ran down into my grandmother's basement and shouted at the devil. I was like, "You can't have me!" And
Amen.
when I think about I was immediately like, okay, I had just been saved. Let's think about that. I had just been saved, quote unquote. My first act was a declaration of war against something, and it's like the love thing got wired with conflict and with life or death to some degree. And when you're that young, there really can't be any consent. Like a 5 or 8 or 10 or even a 13-year-old kid cannot truly consent when the option they're given is total love or total abandonment by an all-powerful, all-seeing, all-knowing divine entity. I mean, then you lose connection with your own intuition, your own sense of agency. So how the fuck could you possibly make decisions for your relationship, your career, your life that are rooted from a place of authenticity rather than a place of just fucking survival?
Yeah. I think it also, from a young age, it twists the very meaning of love. It shapes your understanding of what love is. Just like, if there's a kid who is raised being abused by a parent and, he's told, I love you from that parent who is beating them or abusing them in some way, then your version of love can include that kind of abuse. And you begin to question. Bell Hooks talks about this in All About Love. She says you begin to question the meaning of love, or if it even exists, a child in that scenario. And in some ways, it's the same thing with God. God is love. God is love. God's very nature is love. And God, that same God who is love, can punish people mercilessly, eternally in hell, like Jonathan Edwards holding a spider over a flame. Like if that's included in love, then now you have a particular understanding of love that you carry into your relationships as well. And that affects you in all sorts of ways, both in how you treat people and in what you expect in loving relationships.
Absolutely. Well, before we move on, we're already flying. So let me introduce you. Let me introduce Hellbent and just kind of set the stage. And then, Brian, I'd love for you to share kind of like the origin story. I mean, how this all started, going back to, you mentioned your fundamentalist upbringing. You mentioned deconstructing from that into evangelicalism. I want to hear about Bob Jones, because an interesting point. I went to Lee University, and Lee University, Cleveland, Tennessee, is the original home of Bob Jones University in the 30s.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So it was like, I was like, wow, okay, there's a resonance with the very strict kind of way of existing as a Christian. So I have today with me my friend Brian Recker, who I first got to know as the guy who used to be an evangelical pastor. And Brian is a public theologian, writer, and now author of Hellbent: How the Fear of Hell Holds Christians Back from a Spirituality of Love, which, by the way, releases on September 30th. You can pre-order. I'll have links in the show notes for how you can order that book. And this book, I will say, Brian, just sparks tons of imaginative ways that we can live now. Like it deconstructs, it names the unnameable, and then invites a new framework. It's absolutely beautiful. So as we dive in, will you share kind of like your origin story, how you were raised in the church, like your first experiences there, and then how you got to this point where you're writing a book critiquing hell and deconstructing that?
Man, first of all, Mike, thanks for having me, dude. And it means a lot that you would say that about the book. I feel like I had those kind of ambitions because I knew that Deconstructing Hell was more. I had read Rob Bell's book. I feel like I had lost my belief in hell, but what's on the other side of that is a big question mark for a lot of people. And to do that in a way where I'm not just giving you answers and saying, here's the new set of dogmas that you have to believe now that we tore down the old ones, but to actually invite people into a new framework of curiosity, and learning how to live with that. Yeah, it was a lot of fun to write. It was really good for me. I wrote the book that I felt like I needed 10 years ago, or even more, honestly. The dedication, I guess, kind of says it all. I dedicated it to, it says, for my children, for my own inner child, and for the children still anxiously squirming in the pews. And in some ways, I'm still preaching that to myself, because I was raised, like you said, as a fundamentalist. Hell was very central. I got saved at 5 years old, fundamentalist pastor, Bible services every year, got saved 300 more times before I was a teenager. And once puberty hit in, those salvations really jumped up, because every time I experienced any lust or, jerked off or something like that, I thought I lost my salvation. I was on this fear cycle, right? My first deconstruction you mentioned, so I went to Bob Jones University, and really I was in a bubble up until that point. I was homeschooled, homeschooled fundamentalist pastor's kid, and go to Bob Jones. But that's where I first met some evangelical friends and got exposed to just Christianity outside of the cul-de-sac of fundamentalism, which evangelicalism turns out to be a cul-de-sac as well. It's just a bigger one, but it's still, I think, kind of a dead end. But, exposed to people like John Piper or Tim Keller, who were outside of my fundamentalist world and were very expansive in my thinking, because as bad as you might think evangelical preachers are, I grew up on do the right thing or you're going to burn forever. It was just law, law, law. There was little grace, little gospel, little even about Jesus. It was I grew up in some Old Testament shit, fire and brimstone shit. And so encountering, for instance, Tim Keller quickly became my favorite preacher in my late teens, early 20s, where the message shifted from that law and punishment to this new orientation of, oh, it's about what Jesus did for us. But it took me a while to realize that was still a message rooted in punishment, where I needed Jesus to take the punishment for me, and I was supposed to respond to that grace. But the grace was still something that had to be received only through exclusive belief in this thing that Jesus did for me. And if I didn't make that decision, I would still be punished. And God was still bound by punishment, actually. God had to punish Jesus or me. It was like, which way is the punishment going to go? But even in evangelicalism, so it was like a less punitive worldview. And yet it took me some years to realize punitiveness was still at the center of that worldview and really shaping the way that I viewed God and everybody else. I guess I'm going on a tangent here. Do you want to know more
I
about
love
Bob
it.
Jones? Or
Yeah, no, no. I mean, I think it's important that people know that this whole deconstruction thing is a process that has a certain spiral pattern to it. It's not always one thing, because you leave fundamentalism, you move into evangelicalism, and you continue to listen to what did not feel right. And as you tuned into that, you took action around what was a better way of living.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. There was a little brief pause in there, I think, where I think becoming a pastor made it difficult to listen for a little while because I did put myself under that institutional pressure. It seemed like this really natural thing. I was falling in love with the church again once I was out of evangelical or out of fundamentalism. I was kind of fired up. I was reading. I mean, I love Jesus. Like Jesus is incredible. I started to go into depths with the person of Jesus that had me excited about ministry, and I became a pastor. But I was in that world of evangelicalism, and I didn't realize at the time the ways that I would have to ultimately probably censor myself, keep myself from continuing to evolve, because it's very hard when you're placed in an organization and in a web of relationships, and your financial compensation, all of that is dependent on continuing to ascribe to particular dogmas. It's very hard to question those dogmas with any kind of objectivity. Um, Even though pastors have theological education, they are probably the least objective when it comes to evaluating a theological position because they're being paid.
Yeah, 100%. It's like a salesperson is not going to be objective about the product that they're selling. They really want you to have the best view of it, right?
And I'm not even not like I don't think most of them are aware of that at all. I became much more
No.
aware of it when that pressure was off my shoulders. While I was still in that world, I wasn't like consciously like, oh yeah, I'm going to do this evil thing. I'm going to, go against my conscience. That's not, I don't think where the vast majority of people are. I think there are some slimy people at the top of those institutions that are, in fact, they don't give a shit. Like there are some people I'm like, man, you should really know better some of the stuff that you're saying. And I suspect them of being grifters, but I try to not pass that judgment because I know that I was not a conscious grifter in that way. But I
Sure,
do know that
sure.
when those pressures were off me, I all of a sudden realized I'm allowed to evolve.
Yeah, yeah. Um, so getting into hell, let's just get into hell together here. You
Let's get
write
into
in,
hell together.
let's just hop in. The water's fine. You write in your introduction, and I just want to read this. I think it sets the stage for what Hellbent really is all about. You write, for many of us, spirituality has been so defined by fear that if we uprooted punishment from our faith, there would be no positive spirituality left. We don't have a map for imagining spirituality outside of punishment. My goal in this book is to help you rewire your brain and start to imagine a spirituality of love beyond a punitive God. So, can you alluded to this earlier. There's the fire and brimstone preacher archetypal image that we think of when we think about the hell thing. But anyone listening to this podcast, and I would say a majority of people listening to any podcast you're on, if they are involved in a church, they're involved in a church that does preach a certain like lovingness to it, right? There are people listening to this channel that have left church a long time ago, but still, I had clients today, Brian, who are living with this sense of I'm bad and I'm afraid. And it's all rooted in the conditioning of religious conditioning of their childhood. Can you talk a bit about this fear, this spirituality of fear, of avoiding punishment, and how it showed up for you and how you've seen others, particularly in the queer community, because you talk a lot about your queer brothers and sisters and how that has been experienced and had to be overcome?
Well, we were all, well, not all, the majority of us were taught from when we were young, if we were raised in a church like this, that we were born sinners, that we were born depraved, and really worthy of hell from birth. And, some Christians allow for like an age of accountability and that sort of thing, which again is totally made up, really just to kind of turn down the temperature a little bit on how horrific that sounds, that like babies are worthy of hell. So they kind of believe that they hold this weird tension where, yeah, babies are actually worthy of hell, but God kind of maybe gives them a pass up until an age of accountability. But we're born inheriting that original sin, which is, and I don't go into extreme detail on this, but that's actually not taught in the Bible. That the Eastern Church does not have that teaching. So this is kind of a bit of a Western way that this presents. Not that we have the corner on punitive, fear-based religion, but the way that many of us were taught it was that there was something wrong with us that we were born with. And I felt that pretty deeply myself. And like I guess I already mentioned, it really became quite intense, especially when I went through puberty and experienced sexual desire, because this is often bound up in sex as well. I remember as a kid, just being afraid that God was going to punish me. And a lot of that was fueled by some of these fire and brimstone type services. And then when it came to communion, that was an especially visceral moment where I was being presented with this idea that you're not supposed to eat or drink unworthily. And so I would often feel like I was doing this really extreme accounting of my sins before I could go and take the juice and the cracker. And my dad, who is a preacher, might remind you that, yes, some people have gotten sick and even died because they took it unworthily. And so, like, as a 7-year-old, I'm sitting there like, well, I hope I don't die. Maybe I shouldn't take it, especially if I had some sort of a dirty thought or something like that. And so all of that and that's my relationship with God. And so Christians, we talk a lot about our relationship with God, but many of us have a relationship with God that really is about checking in. Am I on the right or wrong side of that line of punitiveness, really? And that is rooted in a hell-based spirituality, because if you believe that that's on the table at all, then that does become the priority. I say in the book that hell, it sucks the air out of the room in terms of a positive vision of spirituality, because if anything like hell exists, anything that extreme and horrific, then really the most important thing about this life is just not going there. And it really does make the entire point of spirituality not going there. And so you're always just concerned with making sure that you're in that right place. Now, not everybody fixated that much. Like, I think those of us, it's almost like you have more spiritual trauma the more seriously you took this whole thing.
Yeah,
And I
100%.
find that for queer people, they took it the most seriously because they were made to feel the most broken. The more broken the system made you feel, the more you often doubled down on the supposed cure. You were being told that you had a disease that was this sinful thing. You're detestable in God's sight. So often it was queer people in the church who doubled down on that cure, which was fear-based religion, to try to feel better. And the most extreme form of that, of course, is conversion therapy, where it's like, please, something needs to fix me because I can't live every day thinking that I'm a piece of shit in both the sight of God and myself. And that, in that sense, when they were feeling those thoughts about themselves, that was them being spiritual. That was their spirituality. So fear becomes an act of spirituality. I remember I tell this story in the book at Bob Jones. Dr. Bob III had this mantra he would have us all say before we would go back home for Thanksgiving or a long break. He wanted us to have hell in the front of our minds as we went to be around our family members, our loved ones, maybe unsaved friends. And so we would stand up as a student body and we would all say together, the most sobering reality in the world today is that people are dying and going to hell today. He would have us say that like twice, I think. And I would feel it in my chest, this sense of, okay, the most spiritual thing I could do is to try to rescue people from hell. Because if that's real, again, that's the most important thing we could do. So as I got hell central in my mind and the fear of it and making sure I didn't go there, making sure other people didn't go there, that was spirituality for me. And now in retrospect, I can see that in many ways that's the opposite of true spirituality, which is meant to connect us together to our oneness, as opposed to separating ourselves from God, our own hearts, and from other people, that we are having to go back home on Thanksgiving to convert people. Like I can't just enjoy the goddamn holidays. I'm on a mission project around the turkey. I've got to save you guys.
Oh, I mean, like no joke, the missionary attitude. I mean, you call it what it is. It's a colonizer's mentality, right? It's the colonial view of the wild, the unknown. I've got to tame it. I've got to get it in alignment with how it should be. And so you can't relate to people. You have to see them as objects to be molded into the right image, because they aren't in the right image. They're broken. Can you talk about this? Because you in your book, you one of the things that I really resonated with was, kind of makes me, I tear up a bit. Like, it was your Uncle Rex. You talk about, like, he got invited, your dad invited him to the church for, like, to hear a message, and just like the experience of him walking out, and then your dad being like, at least he heard the truth, that kind of thing. Talk about, if you don't mind sharing about that experience a bit, but also just how a centralized hell spirituality affects relationships in general.
Yeah, so my dad got saved in college and transferred. He was at Clemson. He got saved when a Bob Jones University student gave him the gospel, and he went to a fundamentalist school, transferred from Clemson to Bob Jones. So the rest of his family were not born again Christians. They actually, here's the funny part, they actually are Christians, most of them. I think Rex is an atheist now, but he grew up in a progressive Christian household. They were like Presbyterians. They were Easter and Christmas type of Christians.
Yeah.
But they considered themselves Christians. They weren't like not even non-Christians. But to my dad, they weren't Christians. And so I was raised being told that our family members were unsaved. And, they smoked, they drank, they did that bad unsaved stuff. And so we would, at holiday get-togethers, we'd be praying for them in the car on the way there. And I would be in these places with my family members. Like, I never really felt intimate with them. I always felt like we were in a different place. We were separate from them. And they felt that about us too, right? Like, I can actually see it from their perspective now, that we were coming in with this sense that, like, we're not going to partake in any of your alcohol. Like, and my dad would always offer to pray when nobody else really wanted him to, but he would like do this loud prayer. So we were coming in as interlopers almost, and it made us totally alienated from our family members, because we had this idea that they were all damned and going to hell, and we weren't. We had the truth that they needed. And my dad, yeah, you mentioned the story. So my dad was always inviting Rex to church, because he lived in New York City as well, where my dad's church was, and he didn't really want to come because he didn't believe that stuff. But it was like our anniversary service, and Dr. Bob, who I mentioned earlier, the university president that my dad went to, that I went to, he was going to be there speaking at this anniversary service, and so Rex was finally like, okay, yeah, sure, I'll come, I'll celebrate. It's a cool, milestone for you. And Dr. Bob preached a sermon called "How Hot Is Hell?" And I don't remember everything that he said, but I remember, like, the points were something like "too hot for you" or something. And, like, I mean, he talked about the flames and, like, the different color of flames, and how, like, black flame is the most powerful flame. And since the Bible says that hell is dark and fire, that it's probably black flame, which is like, it burns at this incredible, like, he went into details. And I'm just sitting there, and I remember, I'm like, I don't know exactly how old I was. I'm guessing around 10 or so. And I was squirming, and I remember feeling so uncomfortable looking over at Rex, knowing this was probably making him feel so uncomfortable. But I was confused by that feeling. I felt guilty that I felt that way, because aren't I supposed to say, yeah, Dr. Bob, tell the truth. This is God's truth. Come on, Rex, get that truth in your heart, buddy, repent. But instead, I'm like, what are we doing? This feels so wrong. And I felt bad that I was having that. And I thought, man, if I was more spiritual like my dad, then I would just be so full-throated, so bold for the gospel. But now I can see now that that was an intuition that I had, that what we're doing is alienating ourselves from others. This is wrong. I can see that clearly now. But at the time, I didn't know what to do with those feelings. And afterwards, I remember I mean, Rex was offended by the sermon, and he communicated that. And my dad had to ultimately say, "Hey, well, sometimes the gospel's an offense, but at least he heard the message, and that's all we can do." And I was very sobered by that because it almost felt like, "Oh man, that's a nail in the coffin. Rex is definitely going to hell."
I think this is, the levels, the internal, the interpersonal, and then there's the macro level, like just all the issues of justice that are centered around some kind of biblical dogmatic belief, but the impact on relationships that otherwise would have been good. I think that for me is what brings up the sadness, is how many relationships that and I know so many others objectified, saw those people as essentially bad that needed to become good rather than like gods to experience. You know what I mean? And there were so many family members and friends that what could I have learned from them? Like, how many people had secure attachments in my high school that I could have learned about secure attachment? But I was like trying to convert them in my anxious avoidant attachment to get saved. And like, geez,
we miss out on so much wisdom.
Absolutely.
And we still do. I think Christian supremacy, I think that even in progressive Christianity, the assumption that Christians have like the corner on how to live well, and that's where we should be learning from primarily, or that we're even more spiritual than other people just because we're Christians. I mean, you mentioned the macro level, so maybe I should hold off. But yeah, what I was thinking of was not even just individual people, but entire spiritualities. Like, instead of colonizing indigenous people, if Christians would have sat at their feet and learned from them, I think that our spirituality could have been enriched. Instead, we tried our best to wipe them out.
Yeah.
And that happens in personal relationships, essentially, too.
Well, there's like, it disconnects you from the feminine, from the elements. I mean, all of the ways that we lose access to just spirituality. I'm reading a book now that talks about just the indigenous spirituality within each person, because everyone at some level comes from something that is rooted into the earth. And it's just the colonizing effect that pulls us away from that. I mean, Christianity has been a massive catalyzer in that, but the macro level, like let's dive into that a bit. I mean, it still is something that I notice in myself. Absolutely. Like, there's some kind of old voice that's connected to the collective consciousness of like, oh, that's a lesser problem. That's not actually that big of a deal, because ultimately the goal is about salvation, about escaping hell. And so we don't care for the widow. We don't care for the poor. We don't give a shit about what's happening in Palestine. Like, talk through how a spirituality of hell distorts our ability to care for our neighbor and for people who are being marginalized and harmed.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one of the most damaging things about hell being in the picture is it does take the point of spirituality off of this life and puts it on the life to come, and also makes spirituality something different from the flourishing of people and the earth. And I think we've just got that all wrong. I think spirituality is about how we live. It's about how we flourish. It's about how we live together. It's about how we all can live, and making space for us to all live the kinds of life that God wants for us, wholeness of life, shalom. That's what the message, and you don't have to go outside of Jesus to see that. This isn't some wacky thing. That the kingdom of God is an earthy message. It's on earth as in heaven. The problem's not in heaven. The problem's on earth. That's where we need spirituality. And for me, reclaiming that and recognizing that whenever I do that, people will often push back because it feels like, oh, you don't really care about spiritual things. You're just like a materialist. But no, I think that the earth is charged with the grandeur of God, that actually this stuff is God's stuff, that actually how we live and treat everybody, this is the spiritual playing field. It's right here. It's right now. This is the whole point of it. It's to love ourselves and God and other people in this world, and to create a world that is rooted in the justice and love of God. And of course, especially the way that that starts, the way into that, according to Jesus, is by centering the vulnerable. This is an upside down kingdom where the last are first. And really, that's not because the poor are more important than everybody else and that the rich don't matter, but actually because the very people that the world refuses to center and refuses to see, they have no visibility in the world. That's the humanity that needs to be most elevated, because those people are equally divine, filled with God's image, just like everybody else. And until the poor are liberated, nobody's liberated. And so I think that's where Jesus' message starts. So that's the gospel. The gospel is good news for the poor. And when we make it about where we go when we die, I think we miss the good news completely. And you end up making incredible compromises. A great example of this just happened. You have Doug Wilson being platformed by Pete Hegseth. I don't know if you heard about all this. Maybe just to catch up your listeners really quick. Doug Wilson is an authoritarian, patriarchal theonomist. He believes in a theocracy. He wants to see really Christians dominate society, and he's a Christian nationalist. He's a white Christian nationalist. And Pete Hegseth, the U.S. Secretary of Defense, retweeted him and is a disciple of him, which is very dangerous. So you have this very conservative, theocratic agenda in high places of power. And Doug Wilson has this very patriarchal, demeaning to women, a misogynistic worldview. And he believes women should not have the right to vote. He believes every household should have a vote. And he's been an apologist for the Confederacy, and has said that slavery really wasn't that bad. All this kind of stuff, right? And evangelicals have kind of distanced themselves from his more out there sort of positions, but they have often platformed him where they have common ground. And so John Piper invited Doug Wilson to a Desiring God conference a few years ago, and he came under some criticism because it was like, hey, this guy's a racist, misogynist. Like, why are you doing that? And his answer was, Doug gets the gospel right. When it comes to substitutionary atonement, Doug really understands that we are saved purely by God's grace through what Jesus Christ accomplished on the cross. That's what Piper said. So for Piper, man, okay, I get it. There's some stuff I don't go there with Doug. But at the end of the day, when it comes to the things that really matter, how to get saved, right? That gospel, that good news. So for them, the gospel is understanding, why does that transactional cross thing matter so much? Like, what does that have to do with my Tuesday? What does that have to do with Gaza? What does that have to do with my relations? Like, what are you talking about right now? He gets the God, like, what do you, that gospel, because of hell. That's why that matters. Of course that matters, because they believe that your biggest problem, the biggest problem in the world right now, is not a genocide going on. It's not the fact that scientists say that within 20 years we could be facing climate disaster. No. The biggest problem, if hell is real, is hell. And so it it totally ruins our possibility for a spirituality for this world. But I don't want a spirituality if it doesn't have to do with how we live together on this, what Martin Luther King Jr. called the world house. Learning how to live together in peace, because otherwise we're going to tear each other apart. That's the kind of eschatology I think we need to be talking about as Christians. The one that helps us live in this world, not the one that helps us escape it.
Yeah, you write around this topic, around the macro, kind of the impacts, the social impacts, the political impacts of a theology of hell or a spirituality of hell. You say, evangelicals often speak of good deeds like caring for the poor as a distraction from the, quote, main thing. This focus on hell doesn't just make conservative evangelicals ignore social welfare. It frequently causes them to actively oppose it. And I mean, just I thinking archetypally here about social welfare, this sense of well-being at a collective level, to actively oppose that, there is no, my mentor often says, there is no other. There's only your perception. And so if you are actively opposing the welfare of the other, that's because that was internalized first. You are actively opposing your welfare as well. And I think that, to me, is one of the biggest cornerstones of this is we got trained up. These Christian nationalists didn't just wake up like this. They weren't born this way. This was something that was wired in them over and over and over again to quite literally ignore what is well, what is good in their own bodies. And then from there, that software just keeps writing itself. You just create unwellness everywhere around you, because the body, the desire, the want, the wish, what you want for your life is completely secondary. It's a distant second to the main thing.
Um, Yeah, no, that's well said. I think that I like what you did with social welfare, even just seeing that, not just like, I think that specific line, I was even talking about how they oppose that politically, but you're right. They're really not, they don't see even just the welfare of our society as a goal of their spirituality. That's absolutely true. Um, I mean, I was even told like you shouldn't have utopian visions for society, that's like, well, they would obviously denigrate socialism. And one of the reasons is that this world is not our home. And so, yeah, to focus on that is a distraction. Really, that's not what it's all about. What they have apocalyptic visions for society rather than utopian visions for society, more
Right.
rooted in the destruction of the earth and the escape of the earth, and ultimately conquering the earth. For Christ, as opposed to really seeing everybody on earth flourish, which I think yeah, I think that should be God. That's God's dream for the world.
Yes. Yeah. Um, so what is the way forward? What is this, as you talk about it in your book, a spirituality of love? What's our pathway? Like, how does Jesus illuminate that? What needs to happen for people to move that direction?
Wow. I don't give a systematic theology in this book. I'm, first of all, not a systematic thinker. And then I also just don't think that that's what we received in the story of Jesus. We received a life to imitate. And I think the way forward is that Christianity, for those of us who still would consider ourselves in that Christian space or in that world, it needs to become more about imitating Jesus than anything, and figuring out what were Jesus's priorities. So for me, the reason I still call myself a Christian is because the idea of Christian is like a little Christ, someone imitating Jesus. The first Christians, before they came up with that word, it was people of the way. And so the idea is the way of Jesus. That's why I call that section of the book a way of love. This is a way of life. It's not a list of beliefs. And for some people, they won't be comfortable with that name Christian simply because of what it's been associated with. But for me, the reason it still works is I still think Jesus is worth imitating. The spirituality of Jesus is not a problem. Like if you look at Jesus's relationship with God, the kind of relationship that Jesus has to God and other people is the kind of relationship that I want with God and other people. The way that Jesus talked about himself, I would love to feel that way about myself. That sounds self-aggrandizing. I think Jesus, we are meant to see that as an imitation. We are meant to see that light within. I and the Father are one. Yes, I want to feel at one with God in that way. I do. And actually, that sounds blasphemous for Western Christians. Eastern Christians are very used to that kind of language. That actually they see that sense of entering into communion with God at that level as the whole point of spirituality. And so Jesus, we made Jesus into a hero figure, a savior figure that is not one to imitate. We just grovel and we receive that salvation. But the whole point of spirituality in the way of Jesus is really to become like Christ. And that the New Testament is full of that. And so to me, that is the way forward, is not a punitive religion of needing to be rescued from God, really. Now, I think there's a place for rescue language, even salvation language. Like, I think we need to reclaim some of that language, but we need to help people reframe it. For me, I'm not saved from punishment. I'm saved for love. So when people ask, like, well, do you need to be saved in your paradigm? I kind of say, well, it depends what you mean by need. I don't need to be saved or else God's going to punish me. I don't need to be saved or else, right? There's no or else with the need. I need salvation like I need love. Of course, I need salvation. I need God. Am I lost in one sense? Yes, in one sense, we all are in need of one another, of our connection to God. We are not atomized people. Like there is a neediness, but I think for us, we received a spirituality that where we were only told that that if we didn't experience that salvation, then we were eternally fucked. And I don't believe in that kind of salvation where you need it like that. I need salvation like I need you in relationship, or I need God in that same way. We need each other.
Yeah. our words create our reality, then how we talk about God and the language we use in relationship to God really matters. And so if salvation is kind of the orientation, then that implicitly means that you have to be in somewhat of a state of crisis in order to be saved, like to be rescued. If your primary relational dynamic with the divine is, Savior needing to be rescued, then like in order to have connection with God, you actually have to go and live out a crisis life, a crisis-oriented life in order to receive the embrace. But if it's not a salvation experience and it's an embrace, a loving embrace, then that expands the whole thing. You're not living in a state of life or death. You're living in a space of abundance and generativity. That's a whole different framework.
That's true. And honestly, though, when your framework is broken, here's the thing. I think some of that language, that salvation language, can still be helpful because sometimes we do have those dramatic moments. Deconstruction can feel like salvation. When your frame breaks and you realize, oh my gosh, this wasn't working. And actually, this way of thinking was alienating me from other people and from God. And when you realize that actually the love was always there, that belovedness was right there, that the breath was right there, that your voice, that the sound of the genuine was right there for you to listen to. There is a like it can feel like scales falling from your eyes a little bit, right? And so some of those metaphors are still quite sweet to me, but it's not about like, oh man, I was going to be punished from there. Richard Rohr says it best: sin is its own punishment. And I think when we are living outside of love, living in a way that alienates us from others and from God, we experience those consequences as a natural consequence of living in that state of alienation. And when we choose connection and when we press into the reality of the grace that was already there, because I don't believe salvation. Here's the problem with the transactional view of God is salvation is about changing God's posture towards me rather than changing my posture towards God. As if God's back was turned towards me until I prayed the prayer, believed the right thing, and then God was like, all right, I guess I won't punish you. I guess I'll love you. And I think the love goes in one direction for God. I don't think that God turns on God's heel and says, all right, well, I guess I'll turn towards you in grace. That's what grace is. It's unearned. It's always pouring out. The mercy is always there. I think that we can turn away from it, and not in the sense that we turn away. Like all of this language can actually still sound very Christian in the sense that like, oh, if you turn away from God's grace, then you go to hell. That's what that means because you rejected this free gift of salvation. But what I mean is you reject the day-to-day experience of that grace in the sense that you are able to live in the reality of your belovedness. I saw a video the other day from an evangelical pastor. And he said, I stitched it actually. He was like, wouldn't it be wonderful and how different your life would be if you woke up every morning and thought, my sins put Jesus on the cross? What would be different about you? Wouldn't you be able to have a close? And I was just like, whoa, man, like you want that to be my first thought when I wake up is you killed Jesus. You better grovel in that today. And for me, that is really the spirituality that you're creating when that's your starting point, is the default is punishment. And as opposed to, I think a beautiful thought to maybe wake up to is that I'm God's beloved, and so is everybody else. And that's always true, but we can certainly live in ways that deny that reality. And so for me, living in light of my salvation is when I'm aligned with the reality of the grace that is already there. I didn't have to create it or manufacture it. The invitation was always open. Just like the parable of the prodigal son, the father is running out. And God's never turned back away. And the question is, are we going to be like the older brother who refuses to go into the party because of who else is in there, or we're not so sure, or we're going to be like the younger brother that receives that grace? And again, like he's still a son. Like I don't believe that hell is a metaphorical typological experience that the older brother experiences, not punishment from God, but the alienation itself is the punishment. And I think people who are sitting out thinking, oh, those other people who don't know about Jesus, they're going to go to hell. They're experiencing that, I think, psychological reality of hell in that very framework.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I know you mentioned, I think it was in another interview you did, the Living Buddha, Living Christ, and Thich Nhat Hanh's work there, and the introduction, Elaine Pagel's pulls forward a number of Gnostic verses, and in the Gospel of Thomas, there's one that's if you bring forward, one of the sayings is, if you bring forward what is within you will save you, and if you don't bring forward what is within you, then what is within you will destroy you. And that the Gnostic Gospels, like when I think about reimagining Jesus, because the name, the language is very coded for those of us who went hardcore into the evangelical world. The reframing, for me at least, has been deeply rooted in the Gnostic writings and understanding Jesus from a whole different perspective and hearing sayings that really put me in touch with the Christ within. What have been, as we kind of wrap up here, what have been the ways that you've reimagined your Christianity, your Christian spirituality, your relationship with Jesus? How has that been reimagined for you in this stage of life?
Yeah. So for me, I still go to church. I am still a church going person. And that is, I do still love just feeling connected to a body of believers. I don't know that we all have to agree on the same things. There are aspects of Christian theology and doctrine in certain creeds that, I might think are more metaphorical than literal, but I find my connection to that community to still be powerful. But I don't think that that's the only place where I receive spiritual connection. I really try to see that everywhere, and in my relationships. And I think Jesus modeled this really well. I mean, Jesus went to the synagogue, but I don't think anybody would say like Jesus was a big church guy. He seemed to really come alive around tables with friends, and like chosen family for Jesus was really important. It's so funny that in evangelicalism, like the goal that we were all working towards was this like sort of man-wife couple, a married couple at the head of a nuclear family with a white picket fence, kind of isolated from everybody. And it's like the opposite of what Jesus did, which was like chosen family, that was just boundary breaking and outside of class distinctions. And so I think where I've most experienced, I think, spiritual connection is also in cultivating that community with people that are outside of the systems. And so over the last few years, some of the relationships that I've made with queer people have been really formative for me because they do chosen family really well, and kind of understanding how we can still for me, deconstructing evangelicalism was a step, but I think we've got to keep going because these bad systems exist outside of evangelicalism too. Like, my girlfriend is not a Christian. She's never been a Christian. She doesn't have that background. She did not deconstruct Christianity. But so it's funny. Sometimes I'll talk about like the patriarchy within evangelicalism, and she'll be like, "Babe, like, that was my whole upbringing. Like, are you kidding me? Like, that's not just evangelicalism. The patriarchy, that's the whole world. White supremacy is not only evangelicalism, right? These are systems that exist outside of evangelicalism. And so for me, that deconstructing, continuing and seeing us as a part of a larger story, and even seeing what Christianity originally was this group of people that was anti-empire, that was ready to dismantle these systems of domination and stand with the oppressed, not with the powerful, but with those being crushed by the powerful. And to always find yourself there, that's where Jesus found himself and why he was ultimately crucified. And so always putting myself there and recognizing that a lot of the times that's not Christians in that space. That's not like always doing the Christian thing. And Jesus wasn't always just looking for the most Christian people, right? Like, that's not the point. And so sometimes God is working, the Spirit is working, and I don't think it has to do with the boundaries of Christianity. That God's Spirit is not limited to Christianity or only moving within Christianity. However, I do think that Christ said that he would be found among the least of these. And so I think that's always the best place to look. Not who's the most Christian, but who is being oppressed by systems of domination. And so I think that's a really good question. Am I on the same side as Jesus is like a driving focus of my spirituality? Um, I've learned a lot about like embodiment, and I still am really bad about that. But I feel like that's something, is like even just recognizing that we all have these embodied experiences. And I learned a spirituality that was very separate from the body. Howard Thurman, in a commencement address, he said that until you learn to listen to the sound of the genuine, you will spend your whole life at the end of strings that other men pull. And so for me, a lot of my spirituality is trying to get in tune with the sound of the genuine, which I believe to be love that resides in each one of us. I believe that at the end of the day, at the core of who you are, Dr. Mike, is love, unspeakable love. And I think that there's a lot of shit that gets like covered over that, and we don't always see it clearly. We don't always hear it clearly. But I think that's the mission for all of us is to listen to that voice of love. And so getting in touch with that love that's already there, I think, is a big part of my spirituality.
I love that. Thank you. This is a different orientation to discover and live out the genuine. There was this study done that measured frequencies or vibrations of different emotions, and there's death, and just above death was shame. Shame was like the closest frequency to death, but the highest vibration that could be measured was authenticity. And the authenticity that it like is unique. It's unique to us. Yeah, we have types, there's Enneagram, there's Myers-Briggs, there's all these types or whatever, but there is only one you that can live that out authentically. And when you do that, it's a vibration that attracts what you most deeply desire, rather than having to manipulate your life and contort and twist in order to get God to turn around and catch his eye or whatever. It opens up to such a more expansive spirituality. As we wrap up here, is there anything that you like? I want to share this before I hop off, like some kind of parting invitation, something you want to share from the book that you want listeners to hear.
One thing that comes to mind is that I do have grief from like the period of my life that I was so closed off to hearing the perspectives of others. For through much of my life, I believed that Muslims were going to hell, that Buddhists were unsaved, that atheists needed to be converted, that people who didn't believe like me needed to be rescued. And the spirituality of Jesus, one of the stories that speaks to me most is the Good Samaritan, and this idea that salvation comes from the other, that people get the wrong lesson from the Good Samaritan. The point of the Good Samaritan is not you should even love Samaritans. In other words, you should even love the outsider. The Samaritan in that story is not the one that receives love in that story. The Samaritan is the bringer of love. The Samaritan is the savior. And just for context, Samaritans were despised both ethnically and religiously. They were heretics. They believed the wrong thing. If anybody's going to hell, it was Samaritans. And so, in other words, the outsider, the one who I'm most likely to write off, who I believe needs me, who needs my teaching, who needs my doctrine, they need to be saved. That's the person you better shut up and listen to, because they will be the ones to save you. And so I'm more in the time of my life that I had this posture of superiority because, like you said, I think we were missing out. And now I'm excited to try to live my life. And listen, that's not to say I don't still fall into the traps of superiority and separation. I'm separate from you. I'm better than you. But to, as much as possible, enter that mind of Christ, of humility, and to recognize that we're all made of the same stuff and we're all in this together. And the people that we're most likely to write off, we need to see God in them most of all. And that's probably where we will meet the God that we need to save us. If there's any kind of salvation that we still need, it's from those people.
Yeah. The Savior is walking down the road, and it's the person that you wanted to reject that's your salvation. I mean, that's beautiful. Jeez.
I say all the time, like, queer people don't need to be saved with the message of the church. Like, queer people will save the church if they would let them. It's the people that've been saying you don't belong here.
Brian, thank you so much for joining us. And if you're interested in buying Brian's book, Hellbent, How the Fear of Hell Holds Christians Back from a Spirituality of Love, it comes out on September 30th. All the links are in the show notes. Brian, thank you for being here and for being authentic and genuine in your spirituality and letting us all benefit.
Thanks so much, Mike.
Hi, Michael here. Hey, seriously, thank you for listening and engaging the Shadow Mike podcast and YouTube channel. I trust today's episode gave you something to reflect on or illuminated a new trailhead to your hidden life. If this episode resonated with you, you can subscribe, leave a comment or review, and share it with your people. This really helps spread the word and boosts our digital presence. Remember, growth isn't a straight line, and we're all figuring it out as we go. I'm grateful to be in this unfolding and excavating work with you. Until next time, be yourself. You've got a good self. And remember, it is all a gift.